Good evening, spooky people of the interwebs. I'm Alexa, the resident ooky spooky girly around here, and while I don't consider myself much of a world traveler yet, someday I'd very much like to be. Islands, with all their isolation, tend to hold a lot of fascinating history. And while today's research is definitely a combination of heck no and heck yes places, be sure to let me know in the comments which ones you'd like to visit. And before I create a pros and cons list, here are the top 5 haunted islands hiding ancient curses. In 5th place, we have Isla de las Muñecas, Mexico. So the island of the dolls in Mexico is like something straight out of a horror movie, but my kind of horror movie, or perfect place. Located on Texuelo Lake, it is home to hundreds of hanging, slowly decaying dolls, thanks to a man named Don Julian Santana. So over 50 years ago, Don Santana left his wife and child and moved onto an island on Texuelo Lake in the Xochimilco canals. I promise I tried to say it right. Let me know in the comments if I got it wrong. According to him, a young woman actually drowned in the lake in the 1950s, and he devoted his life to honoring this lost soul by collecting and hanging up dolls by the hundreds. Eventually, Don transformed the entire island into a doll-infested wonderland. So he began collecting lost dolls from the canals and the trash near his island home. He's also said to have traded produce he grew to locals for more dolls. But he didn't clean them up or attempt to fix them. He just put them up with missing eyes and limbs, covered in dirt and generally in whatever ramshackle state he found them in. Even when the dolls arrived to him in good shape, the wind and weather turned them into cracked and distorted versions of themselves, which I love. He also kept his cabin filled with dolls, which he dressed in headdresses, sunglasses, and other accessories as need be. So despite the fact that most people found this island frightening, he saw the dolls as beautiful protectors, as he welcomed visitors who he would show around, charging just a small fee for taking photos, just for upkeep and stuff. In 2001, Don Santana was found drowned in the same area, in which he believed that a woman had died. So according to legend, the dolls and the island are haunted by the spirits of the dead girl, and perhaps even by, Don himself. Alrighty, so after all that, who wants to go on a road trip with me? Anyone? Look, as long as we leave the dolls alone, I'm sure the curse won't follow us home. Okay, I'm 50% certain, but still. Let's go. In 4th place, we have Lokrum and Daksa in Dubrovnik, Croatia. So both of these places have such dark histories that I couldn't leave either of them out. They work so well together. One of them, Lokrum, is accessible by a regularly scheduled, kinda crowded, taxi boat, whereas the other, Daksa, has no links to the mainland and is actually avoided by locals. So legends and suspicions have surrounded this beautiful island of palm trees and pines since its long-term residents were removed in 1798. So settled on Lokrum since the early around 11th century, the community of Benedictine monks were evicted by Napoleon's troops. The night before their expulsion, the troops placed a curse on those who usurped the sacred ground. Half a century later, Habsburg royal Maximilian, the younger brother of the Emperor Franz Joseph, bought Lokrum. He converted the monastery complex into his pleasure gardens, spending many a happy summer having exotic trees and plants planted and colorful birds imported. He later met his end by execution, even though close friends tried to give him an escape that he didn't accept because, get this, he felt shaving his beard to disguise himself would undermine his dignity if he were to be recaptured, which, I think that tells me plenty about his character. Oh, and from the exclusive beach bistro of the 5-star hotel, Daksa is usually just referred to as another, splash of green in an idyllic panorama of islands that tends to hang out. And if you're looking at the map, Daksa is pretty close, you could almost swim there. But the dotted lines around it kind of indicating sailing routes that really avoid it on purpose, skirting around to just avoid it no matter what. So kind of like Lokrum, in medieval times Daksa was first inhabited by monks, although later well-to-do travelers ignored it, preferring the larger, more accessible island to relax. In October of 1944, partisans were expelling pro-German Nazi forces from great swaths of what would become post-war Yugoslavia, and they arrived in Dubrovnik. Rounding up hundreds of sympathizers, including the city's mayor and local priests, they then took a certain number over to Daksa and executed them. Citizens were warned not to look for their loved ones in any case because there were no graves or burial plots. Dubrovnik simply got on with being part of Yugoslavia, and Daksa was never visited. If it was discussed, the talk turned to ghosts and the bad spirits that haunted the island. And in 2009, someone stumbled on the remains of several bodies. Forensic investigation revealed that there were 53 adult males, some carrying religious items associated with priesthood. A plot was created for reburials and a memorial erected. But even today, very few people visit Daksa, and it's abandoned and pretty much overgrown, so its secrets are hidden, and I'm good. In third place, we have Deadmans Island. Even though it's kind of close to the public, Deadmans Island is home to ghostly lore that is centuries old, so of course I had to talk about it. The list of spectral sightings and strange phenomena grows by the year, ranging from loud clanging noises that ring out in the dead of the night, to hurried footsteps that pace back and forth, or the unearthly moan of a young woman's sobs that fill the air. Tales of supernatural encounters stretch back more than a century, so the Squamish people call the place the Island of Dead Men. And a very long time ago, it said it was the site of a fierce battle. We're talking like northern and southern nations fought over claims to this plot of land. Now, the southern nation kidnapped 200 women, younglings, and elders from the north and held them captive. But when 200 young northern warriors traded themselves for the hostages' freedom, they were cut down on the spot. In the 1860s, the government offered to sell the land to one Samuel Brighouse. He declined the offer, but one of his partners, John Morton, decided why not. He rode to the island where he found hundreds of red cedar boxes scattered, amongst the foliage and perched in the upper branches of the tree, and quickly discovered they were fragile when he reached up to touch one of them, and it crumbled above his head, showering him with the bones of its long deceased inhabitant. Yeah, nope, that's when you run for the hills and say, no thanks. In the 1890s, a plague descended upon Vancouver, and Deadman's Island was used as a pest house. So those who fell ill were sent to the island for quarantine. And if they got better, they were allowed to return home. If not, they never left. From 1899 to 1930, this island was home to a logging dispute. Local authorities and residents alike were kind of outraged by it, and at 6:30 a.m. on April 24th of 1899, when the developer headed out to the island with 30 men, then Mayor James Garden brought almost the entire police force with him to the island. When the developer attempted to cut down a tree, he and his men were arrested. Now, several similar episodes dotted the decades until the lease expired in 1930. In a 1909 incident, police occupied the island overnight to keep loggers at bay, and claimed they heard the rattling of dead man's bones and shrieking skeletons that threatened to haunt anyone who dared cut down trees on the island. The island is home to too many bodies to count. First Nations people, British merchant sailors, early pioneer residents of Moodyville, Hastings Sawmill and the Granite Town site, Canadian Pacific Railway workers who died during construction, victims of the Great Vancouver Fire of 1886, those who succumbed to smallpox, and possibly some of the squatters who made the island their home for many years. No. Absolutely not. That's way too many dead bodies for my liking. Way too many spirits and angry ghosties. Absolutely not. In second place, we have the island of Poveglia. So the island is located in the lagoon near Venice and is famous for being one of the most haunted places in Italy. Tourists and locals alike are banned from this place, which was used for centuries as a place to exile the sick to prevent the spread of disease and, contain the mentally ill in an asylum built in the late 1800s. Yes, I'll backtrack and elaborate, and it's kind of similar to Deadman's Island, but worse. In 1348, the bubonic plague arrived in Venice and Poveglia, and like many other small islands at the time, it became a quarantine colony. The plague on average killed like 1 out of 3 Europeans, and fearing the spread of the disease, Venice exiled many of its symptom-bearing citizens there. So if you sneeze, off you go. At the island's center, the dead and those too sick to protest were burned on giant pyres, and now this includes the tens of thousands of citizens dying on the mainland. And those fires would burn once more in 1630 when the Black Death again swept through the city. The small island was used as a mass burial ground, and ashes from human remains make up as much as 50% of the island's soil. Grapes, I hope it's a good fertilizer. The deaths of nearly 160,000 people on the island have given it its nickname, the Island of Ghosts. Now, a doctor at that asylum that I mentioned a moment ago was known to have experimented on patients with, crude lobotomies, and he jumped from the bell tower in the 1930s after claiming he had been driven mad by ghosts. I wonder why. You torture people and they're gonna haunt you in the afterlife? Go figure. Decades later, nearby residents claim to still hear the bell, even though it was removed many years earlier. A report titled Haunted History states that some restoration work had started in recent history, but abruptly stopped without explanation. Okay, maybe this is one spot on today's list I don't want to visit. And in first place, we have Bell Island. So time to travel to Newfoundland, Canada, but more specifically, the claustrophobic rocky mining tunnels. So there's a sense of miner spirit watching from every corner and crevice in this world, where the shadows flicker and the darkness, it's just heavy. So between when the mines opened in 1895 and the last mines closed in 1966, there were 106 fatalities and, triple those accidents. Miners lost arms, legs, some were left disfigured, while others died of lung disease. No big. Heritage Newfoundland and Labrador reported in 1938 that a methane gas explosion in the number 6 mine killed 2 men and injured several others. In the 1950s, with the implementation of more powerful and faster machinery, miners were often killed or wounded by runaway ore cars and falling debris, to name just a couple of disasters. At the start of the mining, men wore felt baseball hats with the only light flickering from the dull glow of a candle on top, and a tin lamp burning seal oil perched on a rocky ledge. Safety improved by a smidgen around 1911 with the introduction of carbide lamps. And in 1935, 1935, miners wore battery-powered electric lights. But before all those great improvements, miners had no proper bathrooms or eating facilities, there was no warmth, and they worked like 10 to 12-hour shifts for 6 days a week, for 5 to 7 cents an hour, seeing the sunlight only on Sundays. Okay, that sounds like me, but I swear, I do take a day off. Boys as young as 10 worked alongside men as old as 80, picking ore off the conveyor belts, separating the trunks by size and discarding the waste. The site contained 4 major underground mines called Number 2, 3, 4, and 6, which I've already mentioned, and they ran about, 3 to 5 miles in length. And then on the surface, there were 2 more mines called the Number 1 and the Number 5 that were mined out before, going underground. And what's left of the Number 4 mine, folks have heard muffled disembodied whispering, felt an icy wind rush past, footsteps, and often there's a dreadful feeling of being watched. Now, the most unfriendly character to roam the area is not a long-dead miner entering or leaving the tunnels, but a vengeful white woman. So women back then were considered to bring bad luck if they entered a mine, or even walked onto the mining site. Yeah, I can vouch for the fact that miners, similar to actors, can be very superstitious people. Remember, I'm from a Canadian gold mining town myself. Now, the white woman began to appear in the 1940s. And remember how I mentioned the mines didn't have running water? Yeah, the men would collect buckets from a well. So one day when the men went to collect water, and to their horror, discovered the body of a young woman, dressed in all white, floating in the well. Her skin had turned an icy blue in, the post-mortem state, and shortly after removing the body from the well, mine number 4 became a hub of paranormal activity. Men that were heading home after a long shift would get fiercely attacked by this woman. And wounded, they got treated at the nearby hospital, and those events would happen until about the mid-1960s, after the discovery of the killer. Well, the turn of the 19th century dispelled many of the long-standing myths and legends that were once pretty common on the island. In some cases, they actually got replaced with all new supernatural horrors. Bell Island has been labeled the most haunted island in North America. So, moving forward, in the early 20th century up until the 1950s, the island had a blend of ethnicities. We're talking English, Irish, Scottish, German, and more. And they've all got their own superstitions as well. Before Newfoundland joined Canada as a province, it was a lawless place, filled with sailors, stowaways, misfits, and, the folklore got really mixed with the macabre. Wherever you found a piece of land, you planted your home, and there's a lot of things that happen that people still can't explain. What was I forgetting? Oh right, I almost forgot about the fairies. Once there was a man on Bell Island who actually disappeared for quite some time, and when he returned, he was totally different. He suddenly developed a serious speech impediment and walked hunched over with a cane in a jerky, unstable fashion. So the rumor was that the fairies took him. And hey, at the time, most of the community gossiped about this. According to locals, it's very common in old Newfoundland stories that if people have some kind of interaction with fairies, they're changed as a result. People in Newfoundland will also talk about a blast, where they will get an injury of some kind, they'll trespass on fairy ground and they'll be struck with the fairy arrow, and then they'll get a boil or a lump or something that's going to form on their body. And when that lump is cut open, things such as feathers and twigs are going to come out of that wound. And with what I know about fairies, this is officially the scariest curse on the list. They're very much something one does not mess with. Trust me. And that brings us to the end of today, and I'm just going to remind everyone to not mess with fairies. Yes, I know we shouldn't mess with curses as a whole, but I'm going to dwell on fairies for a while because, well, special interest things. Be sure to let me know in the comments if any of y'all have ever visited any of the islands I mentioned today. If you made it out safe, how the heck did you do it? And hey, while you're there, feel free to leave us, a little subscribe, and hit the bell for more from us here at Top 5 Scary Videos, and I'll see y'all next time, you lovely spooky people.